The carousel music drifted through Central Park like a lullaby that evening, its cheerful melody weaving between the ancient oak trees as the sun began its descent behind the Manhattan skyline. It was October 15th, 2010, and the air carried that crisp bite that signals autumn's arrival in New York City. Families were gathering their children, couples were finishing their evening strolls, and joggers were making their final loops around the reservoir. In just a few hours, this peaceful scene would transform into something far more sinister. Sofia Torres was 7 years old that day, a bright-eyed girl with dark curls that bounced when she ran and a laugh that could cut through the noise of the city. She wore a small pink jacket, denim overalls, and her favorite sneakers, the ones with tiny lights that flashed with each step. Her mother, Carmen Torres, sat on a bench nearby, occasionally glancing up from her phone to watch Sofia chase other children around the carousel's perimeter. Carmen had been working double shifts at the hospital for weeks, and this was one of the few moments she could steal to simply be present with her daughter. The other parents seemed relaxed too, caught in that golden hour when the day's responsibilities felt manageable and the evening stretched ahead with promise. There was Mrs. Henderson with her twin boys, always trying to keep them from climbing on the carousel horses. Mr. Patel was there with his daughter, Priya, Sofia's age, and the two girls had become fast friends over the past hour. The carousel operator, an elderly man named Frank who had been working that same spot for nearly 20 years, smiled at the children's excitement as they begged for just one more ride. But as dusk settled over the park, something shifted in the atmosphere. The families began to pack up their belongings, the joggers thinned out, and the usual evening crowd of teenagers and young adults started to claim the space. Carmen called out to Sofia, reminding her it was almost time to go home. Sofia waved back, her little lights blinking as she bounced on her toes, but she didn't move toward the bench. She was entranced by something near the old maintenance shed behind the carousel, something that had caught her attention in the growing shadows. Carmen Torres would replay this moment thousands of times in the years that followed. She remembered looking at her phone for what felt like 30 seconds, maybe a minute at most. She was responding to a text from her supervisor about tomorrow's schedule. When she looked up again, Sofia was gone. Not just moved to a different part of the playground area, but completely vanished, as if the earth had simply opened up and swallowed her whole. The panic that followed was immediate and all-consuming. Carmen shot up from the bench, calling Sofia's name with increasing desperation. Other parents joined the search, spreading out across the playground area, checking behind trees, under benches, inside the public restrooms. Frank, the carousel operator, stopped the ride mid-song, the sudden silence more jarring than the loudest scream. Within minutes, what had been a peaceful evening scene transformed into a frantic search party. The first police officers arrived within 10 minutes of Carmen's 911 call. Officers Martinez and Thompson were patrol veterans who had seen their share of missing child calls, and they approached the situation with professional calm while privately feeling that familiar knot in their stomachs. Most of these cases resolved quickly. Children wandered off, got distracted, sometimes even fell asleep in unexpected places. But there was something about Carmen Torres's voice, the way she described her daughter's sudden disappearance, that made both officers take notice. They established a perimeter around the carousel area and began interviewing witnesses. The responses were frustratingly similar. Everyone remembered seeing Sofia, but no one could pinpoint exactly when they had last spotted her. Mrs. Henderson thought she saw Sofia near the fountain around 6:30, but she couldn't be certain. Mr. Patel was sure Sofia and Priya had been playing together just moments before Carmen started calling, but when pressed for details, his timeline became muddled. The reliability of human memory, particularly in high-stress situations, would become a recurring theme in this case. Frank, the carousel operator, provided the most detailed account. He had noticed Sofia because of her light-up sneakers, and he remembered her lingering near the maintenance shed while other children gravitated toward the horses. He said she seemed to be watching something or someone, but from his position operating the carousel, he couldn't see what had captured her attention. When officers asked if he had seen anyone suspicious in the area, Frank paused for a long moment before mentioning a figure he had noticed earlier, someone in dark clothing who had been sitting on a distant bench for an unusually long time. The description was maddeningly vague. Middle-aged, possibly male, wearing what might have been a dark jacket or sweatshirt. Frank admitted he hadn't paid much attention, because the person wasn't bothering anyone, just sitting and watching the carousel like dozens of other people did every day. But something about the stillness of the figure had stuck with him. The way they never seemed to shift position or check a phone or engage in any of the small movements that people typically make when waiting. As the evening wore on and more officers arrived, the search expanded beyond the immediate playground area. K9 units were called in, their dogs picking up Sophia's scent from her jacket, which Carmen had brought from home. The trail led from the carousel toward the park's interior, winding along less traveled paths that most families avoided after dark. But then, about a quarter-mile from the playground, the trail simply stopped. The dogs circled the area repeatedly, whining with frustration, but Sophia's scent seemed to vanish into thin air. Detective Sarah Chen arrived around 10 p.m. to take lead on the case. She was relatively new to the NYPD's Missing Persons Unit, but had already earned a reputation for her methodical approach and ability to spot details others missed. Chen spent her first hour on scene simply observing, taking in the layout of the area, the sightlines, the various entry and exit points. She noted how the playground was positioned, visible from multiple angles, but also surrounded by enough trees and structures to provide cover for someone who wanted to remain unseen. The physical evidence was minimal and frustrating. No obvious signs of struggle, no torn clothing or dropped personal items, no clear footprints in the hard-packed earth around the carousel. Sophia had simply been there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only the fading echo of her mother's increasingly desperate calls. Chen ordered a more extensive search of the surrounding area, including the lake and more remote sections of the park, but privately she was already forming theories about what might have happened. The interview with Carmen Torres revealed a devoted single mother who worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital. Sophia's father had never been part of their lives, and Carmen's extended family lived in Puerto Rico. There were no custody disputes, no recent threats, no obvious reasons why someone would target Sophia specifically. Carmen described her daughter as outgoing but not naive, the kind of child who would typically be wary of strangers. Sophia knew not to wander off alone and had never done anything like this before. But as Chen dug deeper into Sophia's routine, she uncovered some unsettling details. For the past several weeks, Sophia had been asking her mother strange questions about people watching them. She had mentioned seeing the same man at different locations, once near their apartment building, another time at the grocery store, and most recently at the park during a previous visit. Carmen had assumed these were the innocent observations of an imaginative child, the kind of coincidences that seem meaningful to 7-year-olds, but are actually quite common in a densely populated neighborhood. Now, in the harsh light of Sophia's disappearance, these observations took on a much more sinister tone. Chen made detailed notes about each incident Sophia had reported, trying to piece together a pattern that might identify a potential stalker. The description Sophia had given her mother was frustratingly generic. A man with dark hair who wore ordinary clothes and seemed to be looking at them. But children often notice things adults miss, and Chen couldn't shake the feeling that Sophia might have been more perceptive than anyone realized. The search continued through the night, with volunteers joining police officers and park rangers in combing every inch of accessible terrain. Helicopter units used thermal imaging to scan areas that ground teams couldn't reach, while dive teams prepared to search the various water features throughout the park. The media had caught wind of the story, and news vans began arriving as dawn approached, their bright lights creating an almost surreal atmosphere in the early morning mist. Carmen Torres didn't sleep that night. She sat in the back of a police vehicle, clutching Sophia's jacket and staring at the carousel as if willing her daughter to simply materialize from behind one of the painted horses. Other family members had arrived. Carmen's sister flew up from Philadelphia, and a few cousins drove in from New Jersey. They formed a tight circle around Carmen, taking turns bringing her coffee and food she couldn't eat, whispering prayers and reassurances that felt increasingly hollow as the hours passed without any sign of Sophia. The first 48 hours are critical in any missing child case, and Chen was acutely aware of how quickly those hours were slipping away. She had contacted the FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, and federal agents were expected to arrive later that morning. The case would officially become a multi-agency investigation, with all the resources and expertise that entailed. But Chen couldn't escape the feeling that they were already behind, chasing shadows and following trails that led nowhere. On the second day, a potential breakthrough emerged. A park maintenance worker named Danny Rodriguez came forward with information he hadn't thought important initially. Danny worked the early morning shift, arriving at the park around 5 a.m. to empty trash cans and perform basic upkeep. On the morning after Sophia disappeared, he had found something unusual near the same maintenance shed where Frank, the carousel operator, had last seen Sophia lingering. It was a small piece of pink fabric caught on a splinter of wood near the shed's back door. The fabric was the same shade as Sophia's jacket, and when Carmen Torres was shown the evidence, she confirmed it appeared to match. But the shed had been locked that night, and park officials insisted they were the only ones with keys. How had the fabric gotten there, and what did it mean for understanding Sophia's disappearance? Chen examined the shed thoroughly, noting that while the main door was indeed locked, there was a small window on the backside that could potentially be opened from the outside. The window was high enough that an adult would need to lift a child to reach it, but it was large enough for a small person to fit through. Inside the shed, Chen found evidence that someone had been there recently. Footprints in the dust, disturbed equipment, and most unnervingly, what appeared to be a makeshift sitting area created from stacked bags of mulch. The discovery transformed the investigation's focus. This was no longer a case of a child who had simply wandered off and gotten lost. Someone had clearly planned Sophia's disappearance, possibly using the maintenance shed as a temporary hiding place before moving her elsewhere. But this realization also brought new questions that seemed to multiply with each passing hour. How had someone gained access to the shed? Had they been watching Sophia and her mother for weeks, learning their routines and waiting for the perfect opportunity? And most disturbing of all, where was Sophia now? And what was happening to her while investigators followed increasingly cold trails? The media attention intensified as details of the investigation leaked to reporters. Sophia's school photo appeared on every local news station and began circulating on social media platforms. The image showed a smiling girl with bright eyes and a gap-toothed grin, the kind of innocent face that grabs viewers' attention and doesn't let go. Tips began pouring in from across the city and beyond, each one requiring investigation, even though most would ultimately lead nowhere. Chen established a tip line and assigned officers to follow up on every credible lead. There were reported sightings of Sophia in subway stations, bus terminals, and shopping centers throughout the 5 boroughs. Each report sent teams of investigators racing across the city, only to discover cases of mistaken identity or well-meaning witnesses who had seen what they wanted to see rather than what was actually there. But among the false leads and dead ends, a pattern began to emerge that troubled Chen deeply. Several witnesses reported seeing a man matching the vague description Frank had provided: middle-aged, dark clothing, unremarkable appearance, in various locations around the city over the past several months. Always alone, always watching, always disappearing before anyone could get a clear look at his face. The investigation team created a timeline and map of these sightings, trying to identify any connection between the locations and Sophia's regular activities. What they discovered was chilling in its implications. The man had been spotted near Sophia's school on at least 3 occasions, once outside the grocery store where Carmen regularly shopped, and twice in Central Park during previous visits. This wasn't a random crime of opportunity. Someone had been systematically studying Sophia and her mother, learning their patterns and planning the perfect moment to strike. Chen brought in a criminal profiler from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, hoping to gain insight into the type of person who would orchestrate such a calculated abduction. The profile that emerged painted a picture of someone highly organized, patient, and experienced. This wasn't likely to be a first offense, which meant there might be other victims, other families who had endured the same nightmare Carmen Torres was living through. As the investigation entered its first week, the initial surge of media attention began to fade, replaced by newer stories and more recent tragedies. The volunteer search parties grew smaller, the tip calls less frequent, and Carmen Torres felt the terrible weight of a world that was already moving on while her daughter remained missing. But Chen refused to let the case go cold, even as pressure mounted from her supervisors to focus resources on more recent incidents. The detective had developed a personal connection to this case that went beyond professional obligation. She found herself thinking about Sophia during off hours, studying the girl's photo and trying to imagine what kind of person could look into those trusting eyes and choose to cause harm. Chen had worked dozens of missing persons cases, But something about Sofia Torres had gotten under her skin in a way that both motivated and haunted her. Late one evening, Chen returned to Central Park alone, walking the same path Sofia had taken on her last known day of freedom. The carousel was silent now, covered with a tarp that fluttered in the October wind. The playground equipment stood empty, casting long shadows in the lamplight. Chen tried to see the area through Sofia's eyes, to understand what might have drawn her attention away from the safety of her mother's watchful gaze. Standing near the maintenance shed where the pink fabric had been found, Chen noticed something the initial investigation had missed. From this angle, someone inside the shed would have had a clear view of the bench where Carmen Torres had been sitting. They could have watched and waited, timing their approach for the exact moment when Carmen was distracted by her phone. The level of planning this suggested made Chen's blood run cold. As she prepared to leave the park, Chen's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor. Budget constraints and staffing shortages meant the active search for Sofia Torres would be scaled back significantly. The case would remain open, but unless new evidence emerged, it would effectively join the thousands of other cold cases that filled filing cabinets throughout the city. Chen stood in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of that terrible evening, and made a silent promise to Sofia Torres and her devastated mother. This case might go cold officially, but she would never stop looking, never stop hoping that somewhere in the vast complexity of New York City, a 7-year-old girl was still alive and waiting to be found. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves overhead and carrying with it the faint echo of carousel music that might have been real or might have been the detective's imagination. Either way, it felt like a reminder that some questions demand answers, no matter how long the search might take. What Chen couldn't know as she walked away from Central Park that night was that 12 years later, someone else would finally get the chance to find those answers. The weeks that followed Sofia's disappearance brought a series of developments that would ultimately reshape the entire investigation, though not in ways anyone could have predicted. 3 weeks after that terrible October evening, a security guard at Grand Central Terminal called the police tip line, with what seemed like the break everyone had been waiting for. He was certain he had seen Sofia Torres walking through the main concourse, holding hands with a woman who appeared to be in her 40s. The guard, Marcus Williams, had been following the case closely and recognized Sofia immediately from the photos that had been circulating throughout the city. He described the woman as having short blonde hair and wearing a navy blue coat, someone who moved with purpose through the crowded terminal as if she knew exactly where she was going. Most importantly, he said the girl looked healthy and unharmed, though she seemed subdued compared to the vibrant child in the missing person photos. Detective Chen rushed to Grand Central with a team of investigators reviewing security footage from multiple cameras throughout the terminal. What they found was both encouraging and deeply frustrating. The footage clearly showed a girl who could have been Sofia, walking hand in hand with an adult woman just as Williams had described. But the image quality was poor, the lighting inconsistent, and neither face was clear enough to make a positive identification. The woman in the footage moved with deliberate care to avoid direct camera angles, always keeping her head turned or positioned so that her features remained obscured. This suggested someone who was familiar with the terminal's security system and knew how to navigate it without leaving clear evidence. The pair disappeared from camera view near Track 17, which served trains heading north toward Connecticut and Massachusetts. Chen immediately contacted law enforcement agencies along the entire route, distributing enhanced images from the security footage and coordinating searches at every station stop. For 48 hours, it seemed like Sofia Torres might finally be coming home. Train conductors were briefed, station personnel were on high alert, and media outlets broadcast the footage continuously, hoping someone would recognize either the woman or the child. But as hours turned into days without any additional sightings, doubts began to creep into the investigation. Digital forensics experts who examined the footage more closely raised questions about whether the girl was really Sofia at all. The height seemed close, and the hair color was similar, but children of that age often looked remarkably alike from a distance. Without a clear facial image, positive identification was impossible. More troubling still was the timeline. The security footage was time-stamped 3 days after Sofia's disappearance, but medical experts consulted by the investigation pointed out inconsistencies in the child's appearance that suggested this might not be their missing girl. The clothes were different from what Sophia had been wearing when she vanished, but that could be explained. More concerning were subtle differences in posture and movement that became apparent when investigators compared the footage to home videos Carmen Torres had provided. The woman in the footage remained a complete mystery. Despite extensive investigation and hundreds of tips from the public, no one was able to identify her or provide any information about her connection to the case. She seemed to have materialized at Grand Central Terminal and then vanished just as completely as Sophia herself had disappeared from Central Park. Carmen Torres watched the security footage dozens of times, desperate to convince herself that the blurry figure was her daughter. Sometimes she was certain it was Sophia, the way the child tilted her head, a gesture that seemed familiar. Other times doubt crept in, and she wondered if she was seeing what she wanted to see rather than what was actually there. The uncertainty was almost worse than not knowing at all. As November arrived and the leaves fell from the trees in Central Park, another development shifted the investigation in an unexpected direction. A homeless man named Eddie Vasquez, who often slept near the carousel area, came forward with information he claimed to have been too frightened to share initially. Eddie said he had been sleeping under a pile of newspapers behind some bushes on the night Sophia disappeared, and he had seen something that terrified him into silence. According to Eddie, around 8:30 that evening, he witnessed a man carrying what appeared to be a sleeping child toward the park's east entrance. The man was tall, wearing dark clothing, and moved quickly but carefully as if trying to avoid attention. Eddie said he had assumed the man was simply a father carrying his tired child home from the playground, but the news coverage of Sophia's disappearance had made him reconsider what he had witnessed. Eddie's description of the man was more detailed than anything investigators had received previously. He estimated the person to be in his 40s, with dark hair and what might have been a beard or heavy stubble. The man walked with a slight limp, favoring his left leg, and carried a large backpack in addition to the child. Most importantly, Eddie said he got a partial view of the man's face when they passed under a lamppost, and he thought he might be able to identify him if shown photographs. Chen worked with a police sketch artist to create a composite image based on Eddie's description. The result was still somewhat generic, middle-aged white male with dark features, but it provided the investigation with its first concrete lead in weeks. The sketch was distributed to media outlets and law enforcement agencies throughout the region, generating hundreds of new tips and potential sightings. But Eddie Vasquez proved to be an unreliable witness in ways that complicated the investigation. His memory seemed to change with each interview, and details that he had been certain about initially became fuzzy or disappeared entirely. He admitted to drinking heavily on the night in question, and his timeline of events often contradicted established facts about Sophia's disappearance. Chen began to suspect that Eddie's account might be more fantasy than fact, influenced by his desire to be helpful and his exposure to media coverage of the case. The investigation team faced a dilemma that was becoming increasingly familiar. Every lead seemed promising initially but dissolved under closer scrutiny. Witnesses were unreliable, evidence was circumstantial at best, and the person or persons responsible for Sophia's disappearance had covered their tracks with disturbing efficiency. Chen found herself wondering if they were dealing with someone who had experience evading law enforcement, possibly someone with a criminal background or specialized knowledge of police procedures. As winter settled over New York City, another troubling pattern began to emerge from the investigation files. Research into similar cases revealed a series of child disappearances over the past 5 years that shared certain characteristics with Sophia's case. All involved children between the ages of 6 and 9, all occurred in public spaces where the children had been momentarily separated from their guardians, and all remained unsolved. The cases were scattered across different jurisdictions, one in Philadelphia, another in Boston, a third in Washington, D.C. Local law enforcement agencies had not connected them because the circumstances varied enough that they didn't immediately appear related. But when Chen looked at them through the lens of Sophia's disappearance, similarities became apparent that suggested the work of a single, highly organized perpetrator. Each case involved a child who had been carefully observed prior to their disappearance. Witnesses in every case reported seeing suspicious individuals in the days or weeks leading up to the incidents, and in each case, the trail went cold so quickly that investigators suspected someone with detailed knowledge of police procedures and investigative techniques. Chen reached out to detectives in the other cities, proposing a joint task force to investigate the possibility of a serial offender. The response was mixed. Some agencies were eager to collaborate, while others remained focused on their individual cases. Bureaucratic challenges and jurisdictional issues slowed progress, and Chen worried that valuable time was being lost while administrative details were sorted out. Meanwhile, Carmen Torres was struggling with the emotional toll of her daughter's disappearance in ways that concerned everyone around her. She had taken extended leave from her job at the hospital and spent most of her time either at the police station, asking for updates, or walking through Central Park, retracing Sophia's last known steps. Friends and family members tried to convince her to seek counseling, but Carmen insisted that she needed to focus all her energy on finding her daughter. The holidays were particularly difficult. Carmen couldn't bring herself to celebrate Christmas without Sophia, and the sight of other families opening presents and sharing meals together was almost unbearable. She left Sophia's room exactly as it had been on the day she disappeared, refusing to move so much as a toy or piece of clothing. Carmen spoke to her daughter every night, telling her about her day and promising that she would never stop looking for her. By January 2011, the active investigation into Sophia's disappearance had been officially scaled back due to budget constraints and lack of new leads. Chen was reassigned to other cases, though she continued to work on Sophia's file during her personal time. The FBI task force that had been formed in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance was dissolved, and federal resources were redirected to more recent cases with active leads. The transition from an active investigation to a cold case was gradual but devastating for Carmen Torres. She found herself visiting the police station less frequently, not because she had given up hope, but because the officers she spoke with had less and less information to share. The daily phone calls from detectives stopped, replaced by occasional updates that rarely contained anything substantive. Chen tried to maintain regular contact with Carmen, but their conversations became increasingly difficult. The detective was juggling multiple active cases and couldn't give Sophia's disappearance the attention it deserved. Carmen understood this intellectually, but emotionally she felt abandoned by the system that had promised to bring her daughter home. In March 2011, 5 months after Sophia's disappearance, the case was officially classified as a runaway incident rather than an abduction. This administrative change was made primarily for statistical purposes and didn't affect the ongoing investigation, but it felt like a betrayal to Carmen Torres. The classification suggested that Sophia had chosen to leave, which contradicted everything Carmen knew about her daughter's character and their relationship. Chen fought against the reclassification, arguing that the evidence clearly pointed to abduction rather than a voluntary disappearance. But department policies were clear. Without concrete evidence of foul play, cases involving children Sophia's age were typically categorized as runaways after a certain period of time. The change would make it easier for the department to close the active file while still maintaining the case in their cold case database. The reclassification had practical implications that concerned Chen deeply. Resources allocated for abduction cases were significantly higher than those for runaway investigations. Media attention typically faded more quickly for runaways, and other law enforcement agencies were less likely to prioritize tips and leads. Most importantly, the change in classification would affect how Sophia's case was presented to the public, potentially reducing the number of people actively looking for her. Carmen Torres learned about the reclassification from a brief phone call from Chen, who had fought unsuccessfully to prevent it. The news was devastating, not just because of its practical implications, but because it felt like an official acknowledgement that the authorities no longer believed Sophia was coming home. Carmen spent that evening in Sophia's bedroom, holding her daughter's favorite stuffed animal and wondering if the world was giving up on her little girl. But even as the official investigation wound down, Chen made a personal commitment that she would later remember as the most important decision of her career. She began maintaining her own private file on Sophia's case, copying relevant documents and continuing to follow leads on her own time. Chen had worked enough missing persons cases to know that answers sometimes emerged years after everyone had stopped looking. The detective established a routine of visiting Central Park once a month, walking the same paths Sophia had taken, and looking for anything the initial investigation might have missed. She interviewed park employees, regular visitors, and homeless individuals who frequented the area, hoping to uncover new information or witnesses who hadn't come forward initially. On one of these visits, Chen discovered something that would haunt her for years to come. Near the maintenance shed where Sophia was last seen, hidden beneath a layer of fallen leaves and debris, was a small plastic bracelet. It was pink with white flowers, the kind of inexpensive jewelry that appealed to young girls. Carmen Torres couldn't definitively identify it as Sophia's, but she said it was similar to accessories her daughter liked to wear. The bracelet had been there for months, possibly since Sophia's disappearance, but it had been overlooked during the initial search because of its size and the way it had been concealed by natural debris. Chen submitted it for forensic analysis, hoping for DNA evidence or fingerprints that might provide new leads. But the testing revealed nothing useful. Too much time had passed, and exposure to the elements had degraded any potential evidence. Still, the discovery reinforced Chen's belief that Sophia had been in that area during her final moments in the park. Someone had taken her from near the maintenance shed, possibly after hiding with her inside the building while the initial search was conducted. The bracelet might have been lost during a struggle, or it might have been deliberately left behind as some kind of message. As 2011 turned into 2012 and then into 2013, Sophia Torres gradually faded from public consciousness. Newer tragedies captured media attention, other missing children became the focus of search efforts, and Carmen Torres found herself alone with her grief and determination to find answers. She continued working as a nurse, but colleagues noticed changes in her personality that seemed permanent. The woman who had once been known for her warm smile and easy laughter had become quiet and withdrawn. Chen, meanwhile, had been promoted to detective sergeant and assigned to supervise other missing persons investigations. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now responsible for ensuring that other families received the thorough investigation that Sophia's case had ultimately lacked. But no matter how many new cases crossed her desk, she never stopped thinking about the 7-year-old girl who had vanished from Central Park. Years passed with agonizing slowness for Carmen Torres. Every October 15th, she returned to the carousel where Sophia had spent her last happy moments, leaving flowers and speaking to her daughter as if she might somehow hear across whatever distance separated them. Carmen aged in ways that went beyond the simple passage of time, carrying a burden of uncertainty that never lightened. Detective Chen continued her monthly visits to Central Park, though they became less frequent as other responsibilities demanded her attention. She estimated that she had walked every path in the park hundreds of times, memorizing the layout so thoroughly that she could navigate it blindfolded. But the park kept its secrets, offering no new clues about what had happened to Sophia Torres on that October evening. By 2015, 5 years after Sophia's disappearance, even Chen had begun to accept that the case might never be solved. The trail had gone cold so completely that it seemed frozen in time, a permanent reminder of how someone could simply vanish without a trace in one of the most surveilled cities in the world. The detective had learned to live with the frustration, but she never learned to forget. Carmen Torres, now in her early 40s, had rebuilt her life around the reality of Sophia's absence while never truly accepting it. She had moved to a smaller apartment, unable to bear the memories associated with their old home. She had changed jobs, seeking a fresh start that might ease the constant reminder of loss. But she had never stopped hoping that someday, somehow, she would learn what had happened to her daughter. The years had brought other changes to Central Park as well. The old carousel was renovated, the maintenance shed was replaced with a more modern facility, and new security cameras were installed throughout the area. Children still played where Sophia had spent her last afternoon, their laughter echoing off the same trees that had witnessed her disappearance. Life continued, with relentless normalcy around the space where a family's world had ended. Chen had been promoted again by 2018, this time to lieutenant in charge of the cold case unit. The position gave her access to files and resources she hadn't had as a regular detective, and one of her first acts was to officially reopen Sophia Torres's case for review. She assembled a small team of investigators to examine the evidence with fresh eyes and new technology that hadn't been available in 2010. The review didn't uncover any dramatic new leads, but it did confirm many of Chen's suspicions about the original investigation. Budget constraints and staffing shortages had limited the scope of the initial search, and several potential leads had never been fully explored. Most frustrating was the discovery that evidence from the scene had been stored improperly, potentially compromising forensic analysis that might have been possible with better preservation techniques. But even with advanced technology and unlimited time to review the case, Chen's team couldn't overcome the fundamental problem that had plagued the investigation from the beginning. Whoever had taken Sofia Torres had planned the crime carefully and executed it flawlessly. They had left behind just enough evidence to confirm that a crime had occurred, but not enough to identify the perpetrator or determine what had happened to Sofia. As 2020 arrived and Sofia's case entered its second decade without resolution, Chen found herself facing retirement. She had spent 30 years with the NYPD and had solved hundreds of cases, but the one that had defined her career remained frustratingly open. The detective began making plans to leave the force, but she couldn't bring herself to simply walk away from Sofia Torres without one final attempt to find answers. Chen decided to spend her remaining months with the department, conducting the most thorough review of Sofia's case that had ever been undertaken. She would use every resource at her disposal, interview every witness who was still alive and willing to talk, and examine every piece of evidence with the most advanced forensic techniques available. If this final effort didn't produce results, she would have to accept that some mysteries were simply unsolvable. The review began in earnest in January 2022, exactly 12 years after Sofia's disappearance. Chen assembled a team of her best investigators and presented them with a challenge. Approach this case as if they were seeing it for the first time, without any preconceptions based on previous investigations. She wanted fresh perspectives and new ideas, even if they contradicted conclusions that had been accepted for years. One of the team members was Detective Rafael Costa, a recent transfer from narcotics, who had requested assignment to cold cases because of his interest in analytical investigative techniques. Costa was known for his methodical approach and his ability to spot patterns that others missed. He was also fluent in Spanish, which Chen thought might be useful given the Torres family's background. Costa spent weeks reviewing every document in Sofia's file, creating detailed timelines and mapping out all the locations where evidence had been found. He interviewed Carmen Torres multiple times, trying to extract details that might have been overlooked or misunderstood in previous conversations, and he began spending time in Central Park, not just walking through it like Chen had done, but systematically examining every structure, every hiding place, every angle of observation. It was during one of these methodical searches that Costa made a discovery that would change everything. On a cold morning in late February 2022, while examining the area around an old bench that had been installed near the carousel in 2011, he noticed something that dozens of investigators had somehow missed over the past 12 years. Partially buried beneath the bench, hidden by years of accumulated debris and overgrown vegetation, was the corner of what appeared to be a plastic bag. Detective Rafael Costa's hands trembled slightly as he crouched beside the old bench, his breath forming small clouds in the February morning air. The corner of the plastic bag was barely visible, just a hint of weathered black material, poking through layers of decomposed leaves and urban debris that had accumulated over more than a decade. Most investigators would have dismissed it as ordinary litter, the kind of refuse that collects in every public space across New York City, but Costa had learned to pay attention to details that seemed out of place, and something about this particular piece of trash felt different. The bag was wedged deep beneath the bench's concrete base, positioned in a way that suggested it hadn't simply blown there by accident. Someone had deliberately placed it in this specific location, perhaps believing it would never be discovered, or that by the time it was found, any evidence it contained would be too degraded to matter. Costa photographed the scene from multiple angles before carefully beginning the excavation process, using a small trowel and brush to slowly expose more of the buried object. As he worked, Costa's mind raced through the implications of what he might be uncovering. This bench had been installed in 2011, approximately 6 months after Sofia Torres' disappearance, as part of a park renovation project. That timing seemed significant, though Costa couldn't yet understand why. Had someone returned to this location months after the crime to bury evidence, or had the bag been placed here during the renovation, possibly by someone involved in the construction work? The excavation process took nearly an hour, with Costa taking frequent breaks to document his progress, and ensure that he wasn't contaminating any potential evidence. Lieutenant Chen had arrived shortly after he called for backup, along with a crime scene technician and a photographer. They established a perimeter around the bench area and began the careful process of treating this discovery as if it were a fresh crime scene rather than something that had been buried for over a decade. When the bag was finally fully exposed, it appeared to be a standard black garbage bag, the heavy-duty kind used by commercial cleaning services and construction crews. The material had degraded from years of exposure to moisture and soil, but it remained largely intact. More importantly, the bag was clearly not empty. There was something solid inside, something small enough to fit in the palm of an adult hand, but substantial enough to create a visible bulge in the plastic. Chen supervised as the crime scene technician carefully lifted the bag from its resting place, noting its weight and the way the contents shifted inside the deteriorated plastic. The bag was then transported to the police laboratory for analysis, where it would be opened in a controlled environment that would preserve any trace evidence it might contain. Costa and Chen followed the evidence to the lab, both trying to manage their expectations, while privately hoping that this discovery might finally provide the breakthrough Sophia's case desperately needed. The laboratory analysis began immediately, with forensic technicians documenting every aspect of the bag before attempting to access its contents. They noted that the plastic had been secured with what appeared to be multiple layers of duct tape, suggesting that whoever placed it there had been concerned about protecting the contents from environmental damage. The tape itself had lost much of its adhesive properties over the years, but remnants of the original binding were still visible. When the bag was finally opened, the contents took everyone's breath away. Inside, wrapped in several layers of deteriorated paper towels, was a single child's sneaker. It was small, designed for a foot that would fit a 6- or 7-year-old child, and despite years of burial, it remained recognizable as the type of athletic shoe that had been popular among children in 2010. Most striking of all were the small LED lights embedded in the sole, the kind of novelty feature that had made these shoes particularly appealing to young children. Costa immediately thought of Carmen Torres's description of what Sophia had been wearing on the day she disappeared. According to every witness account and police report, Sophia had been wearing light-up sneakers, the kind that flashed with each step she took. The shoe in the evidence bag appeared to match those descriptions perfectly, down to the size and style that would have been appropriate for a 7-year-old girl. But it was the second item in the bag that made this discovery truly extraordinary. Carefully folded and placed beneath the shoe was a piece of paper, yellowed with age but still legible. Written on it in what appeared to be a child's handwriting were 4 words that would haunt everyone involved in the investigation: "Find me where it all began." The handwriting analysis would take several days, but even a preliminary examination suggested that the writing had been done by a young child using a standard pencil. The letters were carefully formed, as if whoever wrote them had been concentrating intensely on making them clear and readable. The paper itself appeared to be from a standard school notebook, with the faint blue lines still visible beneath the pencil marks. Chen stared at the note for a long time, trying to process its implications. If this was genuine, if Sophia Torres had somehow managed to leave this message, it suggested that she had been alive and conscious when it was written. But the note also raised more questions than it answered. Where had Sophia been when she wrote it? How had she managed to get this message to the location where it was found? And most mysteriously, what did "where it all began" mean? The discovery required immediately contacting Carmen Torres, though Chen dreaded making that call. For 12 years, Carmen had lived with uncertainty about her daughter's fate, never knowing whether Sophia was alive or dead, suffering or at peace. This evidence suggested that Sophia had survived at least long enough to write the note, but it also confirmed that something terrible had indeed happened to her. Carmen's reaction to the news was as complex as Chen had expected. There was relief in learning that Sophia had apparently been alive and aware enough to write a message, but there was also renewed anguish at being reminded of her daughter's fate. Carmen asked to see the evidence immediately, and Chen arranged for her to visit the laboratory under controlled conditions that would preserve the integrity of the investigation. The moment Carmen Torres saw her daughter's shoe, she broke down completely. She had helped Sophia pick out those sneakers at a store in Queens just 2 weeks before her disappearance, and she remembered how excited Sophia had been about the flashing lights. Carmen confirmed that the shoe was definitely the right size and style, though positive identification would require more detailed analysis. But it was the handwritten note that provided the most definitive confirmation. Carmen recognized Sophia's handwriting immediately, despite the fact that 12 years had passed since she had last seen her daughter's careful script. Sophia had been learning cursive writing at school and had been particularly proud of her ability to write clearly and neatly. The note matched samples of Sophia's writing that Carmen had preserved in a scrapbook of her daughter's schoolwork. The phrase, "Find me where it all began," resonated with Carmen in ways that she struggled to explain to the investigators. Sophia had been a thoughtful child who often spoke in ways that seemed older than her years. She had enjoyed riddles and word games, and she often created elaborate stories that incorporated real places and events from her daily life. The phrasing of the note sounded exactly like something Sophia would write if she were trying to leave clues for someone to follow. But what did "where it all began" refer to? Carmen and the investigators spent hours discussing possible meanings, considering every significant location in Sophia's young life. The carousel in Central Park where she disappeared was an obvious possibility, but that seemed too simple and too dangerous for someone to use as a hiding place or meeting location. Sophia's school, their apartment building, the hospital where Carmen worked, all of these places had significance in Sophia's life, but none felt like the answer to her cryptic message. Costa suggested that they needed to think more systematically about the timeline of Sophia's disappearance and the burial of this evidence. The shoe and note had been found beneath a bench that was installed in 2011, which meant the evidence had been placed there after the bench was built, but possibly long before the present day. Someone had returned to this location months or even years after Sophia's disappearance to bury these items in a spot where they might eventually be discovered. The investigation team began mapping out all the locations that had been significant during the original search for Sophia. They revisited witness statements, re-examined security footage, and created detailed timelines of everyone who had been in Central Park during the days and weeks following Sophia's disappearance. If someone had returned to bury this evidence, there might be records of their presence in the area. One theory that emerged was particularly disturbing. The evidence suggested that Sophia had been held somewhere for a period of time after her abduction, long enough for her to write the note and for someone to remove her shoe. The careful burial of these items indicated that whoever was responsible wanted them to be found eventually, but only after enough time had passed that any immediate leads would be cold. Costa proposed that the burial site itself might be significant. The bench was positioned to provide a clear view of the carousel, where Sophia had spent her last free afternoon. Someone sitting on this bench could watch children playing in the same area where Sophia had been when she caught the attention of her abductor. Was this location chosen for its symbolic value, or was there a more practical reason for selecting this specific spot? The forensic analysis of the shoe revealed trace evidence that added new dimensions to the investigation. Soil samples from inside the shoe didn't match the composition of Central Park's terrain, suggesting that Sophia had been held in a location with different geological characteristics. The soil contained traces of industrial chemicals that were consistent with older urban areas, possibly abandoned buildings or construction sites. More intriguingly, pollen analysis revealed plant species that weren't native to Manhattan. The pollen samples suggested that Sophia had been in an area with vegetation typical of Queens or the Bronx, possibly in a location that was partially wooded, but also near industrial activity. This geographic profiling provided the investigation team with their first concrete lead about where Sophia might have been taken after her disappearance. Chen assembled a team of detectives to begin searching for locations that matched the environmental profile suggested by the forensic evidence. They focused on abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and industrial sites in Queens and the Bronx that would have been accessible in 2010 and might have provided the isolation necessary for holding a kidnapped child. The search was methodical but overwhelming. The New York metropolitan area contained thousands of locations that could potentially match the forensic profile, and many of them had been demolished or significantly altered in the 12 years since Sophia's disappearance. The team needed to narrow their focus, but they weren't sure how to prioritize the locations they were investigating. Meanwhile, the handwriting analysis of Sophia's note was completed, confirming what Carmen Torres had instinctively known. The writing was definitely done by a child between the ages of 6 and 8, using a standard number 2 pencil on lined notebook paper. More significantly, the handwriting matched samples of Sophia's schoolwork, with enough precision to satisfy forensic standards for positive identification. The confirmation that Sophia had written the note added urgency to the investigation, but also deepened its mystery. The careful formation of the letters suggested that Sophia had not been under immediate duress when she wrote the message. She had taken time to write clearly and legibly, as if she wanted to ensure that whoever found the note would be able to read it easily. This implied that she had been in a situation where she felt safe enough to write, at least temporarily. Costa began thinking about the note from a different perspective. Rather than focusing on the phrase "where it all began" as a geographic clue, he considered whether it might refer to a person, an event, or a relationship that predated Sophia's disappearance. What if Sophia wasn't talking about a physical location at all, but about the beginning of whatever sequence of events had led to her abduction? This interpretation led the investigation team to re-examine all the evidence suggesting that Sophia had been watched or stalked before her disappearance. The various sightings of suspicious individuals, the reports of someone following Sophia and her mother, the careful planning that had clearly gone into the abduction, all of these factors suggested that Sophia's kidnapping was the culmination of a longer process that had begun weeks or months earlier. Chen decided to interview Carmen Torres again, this time focusing specifically on the period leading up to Sophia's disappearance. She wanted to identify the first time Carmen or Sophia had noticed anything unusual, the earliest indication that someone might have been taking an inappropriate interest in the family. If Sophia's note referred to where it all began, then understanding the beginning of their ordeal was crucial to interpreting her message. Carmen struggled to pinpoint exactly when she first became aware that something was wrong. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, she could identify numerous incidents that seemed significant, but at the time they'd appeared to be ordinary coincidences. The first concrete memory she could recall was from early September 2010, about 6 weeks before Sophia's disappearance. Sophia had come home from school that day with an unusual story about a man who had been watching her during recess. According to Sophia, the man had been standing outside the school fence not doing anything threatening, but his presence had made her uncomfortable. When Sophia pointed him out to her teacher, the man had walked away, and school security could find no one matching his description in the area. The incident had been reported to school administration and noted in Sophia's file, but no further action had been taken because there was no evidence of any actual threat or inappropriate behavior. Carmen had been concerned enough to talk with Sophia about stranger safety, but she hadn't considered the possibility that someone might be specifically targeting her daughter. Over the following weeks, there had been other incidents that now seemed connected. Sophia had mentioned seeing the same car parked near their apartment building on multiple occasions, always with someone sitting inside who seemed to be watching the building entrance. Carmen had noticed a man who appeared to be following them through the grocery store one afternoon, though he never approached them or did anything overtly suspicious. Most significantly, Sophia had reported seeing someone she called the Watching Man in Central Park during their previous visits to the carousel. She had pointed out the figure to Carmen on at least 2 occasions, but Carmen had been unable to identify the specific person Sophia was referring to among the many adults who frequented the park. This pattern of surveillance suggested that Sophia's abductor had been studying her routine for at least 6 weeks before striking. The level of preparation and patience this required indicated someone who was experienced and methodical, possibly someone who had committed similar crimes before. Costa proposed that they needed to expand their investigation to include cases from other jurisdictions that might involve the same perpetrator. The connection between Sophia's school and the beginning of the surveillance also provided a new avenue for investigation. Costa requested all records related to the September incident, including security footage from the school and surrounding area. While most of the footage had been overwritten long ago, there might still be documentation that could help identify the individual Sophia had noticed watching her. The school's security logs revealed several other reports of suspicious individuals in the weeks leading up to Sophia's disappearance. Other children had reported seeing strangers watching the playground during recess, and teachers had been advised to be more vigilant about monitoring the school's perimeter. The pattern suggested that Sophia hadn't been the only potential target, or that her abductor had been conducting surveillance of multiple children before focusing on her specifically. Chen began to suspect that Sophia's note might be referring to her school as where it all began. If the surveillance had started there, and if Sophia had become aware of being watched during that first incident in September, then the school might be the location she was trying to direct investigators toward. But this interpretation raised new questions about what evidence or clues might be hidden there. The investigation team requested permission to search the school grounds, focusing on areas that would have been accessible to Sophia and might have been used as hiding places for messages or evidence. The search was conducted during winter break to minimize disruption to school activities, but it produced no immediate results. If Sophia had hidden something at the school, it had either been found and removed by someone else, or it was concealed so well that trained investigators couldn't locate it. Costa suggested that they needed to think more creatively about Sophia's message. Children often communicated through symbols and references that adults might not immediately understand. Sophia's note might be using language or concepts that made perfect sense to a 7-year-old, but required interpretation by adults who didn't share her frame of reference. The breakthrough came when Carmen Torres remembered a specific conversation she had with Sophia just days before her disappearance. Sophia had been working on a school project about her family history, and she had been particularly interested in the story of how Carmen and her ex-husband had met. Carmen had told Sophia about their first date, which had taken place at the Central Park Carousel in 2002, 8 years before Sophia was born. Sophia had been fascinated by this romantic story and had asked her mother to take her to see the exact spot where her parents had fallen in love. They had visited the carousel together the weekend before Sophia's disappearance, and Sophia had insisted on riding the same painted horse that Carmen had ridden during that long-ago date. Sophia had declared that the carousel was where everything began for their family. The realization hit Chen and Costa simultaneously. Sophia's note wasn't referring to where her ordeal had begun, but where her family's story had started. She was directing them back to the carousel, but not to the general area where she had been abducted. She was pointing them toward a specific location within the carousel area that held personal significance for her family. Carmen Torres accompanied the investigation team back to Central Park for what felt like the 100th time, but this visit was different. They weren't looking for evidence of Sophia's disappearance this time. They were searching for something Sophia had hidden, something she had left specifically for her mother to find. The carousel itself had been renovated twice since Sophia's disappearance, but the basic structure remained the same. Carmen led the investigators to the specific painted horse that held meaning for her family, a white stallion with flowing mane positioned on the outer ring of the carousel. She explained how Sophia had insisted on riding this particular horse during their last visit together, and how important the family connection had been to her daughter. Costa examined the painted horse carefully, looking for any signs that something might be hidden within or beneath it. The horse was solid wood, with multiple layers of paint applied over many decades of use, but he noticed that one small section of decorative trim seemed to have been disturbed and repainted more recently than the surrounding area. Working with park maintenance staff and the carousel operator, the investigation team carefully removed a small section of trim from the base of the painted horse. Hidden behind it, wrapped in plastic and secured with tape, was another folded piece of paper. This one contained a longer message in Sophia's careful handwriting, and reading it would finally begin to unlock the mystery of what had happened to her on that terrible October evening 12 years ago. But even as the investigation team prepared to examine this new evidence, none of them could have imagined that Sophia's second message would reveal truths more shocking and disturbing than anything they had considered possible. The second message from Sophia Torres was longer than the first, written on what appeared to be 2 pages torn from the same notebook. Detective Costa handled the documents with extreme care, photographing them in place before removing them from their plastic wrapping. Even after 12 years of concealment, Sophia's handwriting remained clear and legible, though the paper had yellowed slightly around the edges where moisture had seeped through the protective covering. Carmen Torres stood beside the carousel as Costa read the message aloud, her hands gripping the painted mane of the white stallion as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The words that emerged from her daughter's careful script would forever change their understanding of what had happened during those terrible weeks in October 2010. Mum, if you are reading this, then you found my clue like I hoped you would. I don't know if I will ever see you again, but I wanted to leave you messages so you would know what happened to me. The man who took me said his name is David, but I think he is lying about that like he lies about other things. He has been watching me for a long time, longer than I told you about. He knows things about our family that make me scared. Costa paused in his reading, exchanging glances with Lieutenant Chen. The level of detail and awareness in Sophia's writing was remarkable for a 7-year-old child, but it also suggested that she had been conscious and alert enough during her captivity to observe and remember crucial information about her abductor. The message continued. David said he picked me because I look like someone who used to be important to him. He showed me pictures of another little girl who had the same hair as me and liked the same things I like. He said her name was Emma and that she went away, and now he needed me to help him remember her. I don't understand what that means, but it makes him very sad when he talks about Emma. Carmen Torres let out a strangled sob as the implications of Sophia's words became clear. Her daughter hadn't been chosen randomly. She had been selected because she resembled another child who had some significance to her abductor. This revelation opened up entirely new avenues for investigation, but it also suggested that Sophia's disappearance might be connected to an earlier tragedy. Chen immediately contacted the FBI's database of missing children, requesting a search for any girl named Emma who had disappeared in the years preceding Sophia's abduction. The search parameters were broad. They were looking for children between the ages of 5 and 10 who had gone missing anywhere in the northeastern United States between 2005 and 2010. Sophia's message provided more disturbing details about her captivity. David keeps me in a room in the basement of a big house. There are pictures on the walls of lots of different children, all girls who look kind of like me. Some of the pictures are very old, like from when my mum was little. David talks to the pictures sometimes like the girls are still there, but I think something bad happened to them. The description of photographs depicting multiple children over several decades suggested that Sophia's abductor might be a serial offender with a history stretching back years or even decades. Costa made notes about requesting searches of missing children databases going back to the 1980s and 1990s, looking for patterns that might connect to Sophia's case. But it was the next section of Sophia's message that provided the most actionable intelligence for the investigation. The house has blue shutters and is next to train tracks. I can hear the trains going by every day at the same times. David told me we are in Queens, near a place called Fresh Pond Road. There's a big water tower I can see from the basement window, and David said it belongs to the cemetery next door. Costa felt his pulse quicken as he read these geographic details. Fresh Pond Road in Queens was a specific location that could be thoroughly searched. The combination of train tracks, a cemetery with a water tower, and a house with blue shutters provided enough distinctive features to potentially identify the exact location where Sophia had been held. The investigation team immediately began mapping the Fresh Pond Road area, identifying all residential properties that backed up to train tracks and were adjacent to cemetery property. The Fresh Pond Crematory was the most likely candidate, and aerial photography showed a distinctive water tower on the cemetery grounds that would be visible from several nearby residential streets. Sophia's message continued with details that demonstrated her remarkable presence of mind during what must have been a terrifying experience. David leaves me alone in the basement when he goes to work. He has a job where he wears a uniform and carries keys, like a security guard or janitor. He always comes back at the same time and brings me food from McDonald's or Subway sandwiches. He tries to be nice to me, but I can tell he is getting more sad and angry every day. The description of the abductor's work routine provided investigators with additional search criteria. They were looking for someone who worked in security or maintenance, someone whose job would give them access to buildings and would explain their familiarity with avoiding security cameras and law enforcement procedures. The timing of meals also suggested that Sophia's captor worked a regular daytime schedule. Perhaps most importantly, Sophia's message revealed that she had managed to overhear information about her abductor's plans. Yesterday, David was on the phone with someone, and I heard him say he was going to take me to a place called the Pine Barrens in New Jersey. He said it was time to finish what he started with Emma. I don't know what the Pine Barrens is, but David sounded scared when he talked about it. I think he's planning to hurt me there. The mention of the Pine Barrens sent a chill through everyone involved in the investigation. The vast wilderness area in New Jersey had been associated with numerous unsolved disappearances over the years, and it provided the kind of remote, sparsely populated terrain where someone could dispose of evidence without fear of discovery. If Sophia's abductor had taken other victims to the Pine Barrens, there might be additional evidence hidden in that forbidding landscape. Sophia's message concluded with instructions that revealed both her intelligence and her desperate hope that someone would eventually find her clues. "Mom, I hid this note here because I remembered the story you told me about you and Daddy meeting at this carousel. I thought if something happened to me, you would come back here and remember that story and maybe look for me. I put my shoe under the bench where you always sit when you watch me play, so you would know I was trying to leave you messages." The final paragraph of Sophia's note was barely legible, as if she had been writing quickly or under stress. "I can hear David coming back downstairs. I think he suspects I have been trying to leave clues. If you find this and I am gone, please tell the police about the house with blue shutters near Fresh Pond Road. Maybe they can help the other girls in the pictures, even if they can't help me. I love you, Mom. Don't forget about me." Carmen Torres collapsed against the carousel horse as Costa finished reading, her grief overwhelming her ability to stand. Chen caught her before she could fall, supporting her while Carmen wept with the intensity that seemed to come from 12 years of suppressed anguish finally finding release. The investigation team now had concrete leads for the first time since Sophia's disappearance. Within hours, they had identified 17 properties in the Fresh Pond Road area that matched Sophia's description. Each would need to be investigated thoroughly, but they finally had a manageable number of specific locations to search, rather than the vast uncertainty that had plagued the case for over a decade. Chen coordinated with Queen's detectives to begin immediate surveillance of all the identified properties. They were looking for houses with blue shutters, proximity to train tracks and cemetery property, and any evidence of current or past occupancy by someone who might match the profile of Sophia's abductor. The work would be methodical and time-consuming, but they finally had direction. Meanwhile, Costa focused on the FBI database searches for missing children named Emma. The results were sobering. There had been dozens of girls named Emma who had disappeared in the northeastern United States over the past several decades. Most of these cases had been solved, with the children either found safe or their remains recovered and their killers identified. But several remained open, including one case that immediately caught Costa's attention. Emma Caldwell had disappeared from a shopping mall in Philadelphia in 2008, 2 years before Sophia's abduction. She was 6 years old at the time, with dark curly hair and a bright smile that bore a striking resemblance to Sophia Torres. Emma had been with her grandmother when she vanished, momentarily separated in a crowded department store during the Christmas shopping season. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of Emma had ever been found. The similarities between Emma's disappearance and Sophia's case were disturbing. Both girls had been taken from public places where they had been momentarily separated from their guardians. Both had been under surveillance prior to their abductions, with witnesses reporting suspicious individuals in the areas where they were last seen, and both cases had gone cold despite extensive investigations and media coverage. Costa contacted the Philadelphia Police Department and spoke with Detective Maria Santos, who had worked Emma Caldwell's case. Santos confirmed that Emma's disappearance had never been solved, and that they had long suspected the involvement of someone with experience in evading law enforcement. She agreed to share Emma's case files with the New York investigation team, hoping that the new information about Sophia might finally provide answers about Emma's fate as well. The Philadelphia files revealed additional disturbing parallels. Emma Caldwell had been described by her family as an unusually observant child who paid attention to details that adults often missed. In the weeks before her disappearance, Emma had reported seeing a man who seemed to be following her family during shopping trips and other outings. Like Sophia, Emma had tried to point out this individual to adults, but her concerns had been dismissed as childhood imagination. Most significantly, Emma's grandmother recalled that the little girl had been particularly worried about a man she had seen multiple times near her school. Emma had described him as someone who watched the children during recess but never approached the fence or did anything that would attract the attention of teachers or security personnel. The description matched almost exactly what Sophia Torres had reported about her own surveillance. As the investigation team delved deeper into Emma Caldwell's case, they discovered evidence of a pattern that extended beyond just these two girls. Detective Santos had compiled a list of similar disappearances throughout the region, cases involving young girls who had been under surveillance before vanishing without a trace. The pattern suggested a serial offender who had been operating for years, possibly decades, selecting victims based on specific criteria and using sophisticated methods to avoid detection. The search of properties near Fresh Pond Road began the following morning, with teams of investigators conducting systematic examinations of each house that matched Sophia's description. The work was challenging because many of the properties had changed ownership or been renovated since 2010, potentially eliminating evidence that might have been present during Sophia's captivity. The breakthrough came on the third day of searching, when investigators examining a house on 63rd Street discovered evidence that matched Sophia's description with startling accuracy. The property had blue shutters, backed up to the Long Island Railroad tracks, and was adjacent to the Fresh Pond Crematory with its distinctive water tower. Most significantly, the house had been vacant since 2011, with the last owner disappearing shortly after Sophia's abduction without providing a forwarding address. The basement of the house revealed signs of long-term occupancy that predated its abandonment. There were makeshift sleeping arrangements, evidence of food storage, and most disturbing of all, dozens of photographs pinned to the walls. The photographs showed young girls ranging in age from approximately 5 to 10 years old, all bearing physical similarities to both Sophia Torres and Emma Caldwell. Some of the photographs appeared to be recent, while others were clearly decades old, suggesting that this location had been used by the same individual for an extended period. Among the photographs, investigators found pictures of both Sophia and Emma, confirming that they had indeed been held at this location. But there were many other faces as well, representing girls whose identities were unknown and whose fates remained a mystery. The wall of photographs represented what might be the largest cache of evidence related to child abductions ever discovered in the New York area. Forensic analysis of the basement revealed DNA evidence from multiple individuals, including samples that matched both Sophia Torres and Emma Caldwell. The evidence confirmed that both girls had been held at this location for extended periods, possibly weeks or months, but there was no indication of what had ultimately happened to them or where they might have been taken when their captor abandoned the house. The investigation team also discovered a collection of notebooks containing detailed observations about potential victims. The handwriting matched samples found throughout the house, and the content revealed the methodical planning that had gone into each abduction. The notebooks contained surveillance logs, daily routine observations, and psychological profiles of dozens of children who had been stalked over the years. One notebook contained specific entries about Sophia Torres, documenting her activities and schedule for weeks before her disappearance. The observations were disturbingly detailed, including information about Carmen Torres's work schedule, Sophia's school routine, and their family's weekend activities. The level of surveillance was far more extensive than anyone had realized, suggesting that Sophia's abductor had been watching the family for months rather than weeks. Similar detailed surveillance records existed for Emma Caldwell and several other girls whose faces appeared in the photographs on the basement walls. The pattern revealed an individual who was extremely patient and methodical, someone who studied potential victims extensively before making his move. This level of planning explained why the abductions had been carried out so successfully and why the subsequent investigations had been unable to identify viable suspects. But it was the discovery of property records that provided investigators with their first concrete lead about the identity of Sophia's abductor. The house on 63rd Street had been owned by David Kellerman, a 53-year-old man who had worked as a security supervisor for a large property management company. Kellerman's employment records showed that he had access to buildings throughout Queens and Manhattan, which would have given him detailed knowledge of security systems and law enforcement procedures. David Kellerman had disappeared in November 2010, approximately 1 month after Sophia Torres's abduction. He had stopped reporting to work, abandoned his apartment, and left behind no forwarding address or contact information. His disappearance had been reported to police, but it had been classified as a missing person case rather than a criminal investigation because there was no evidence of foul play at the time. The timing of Kellerman's disappearance aligned perfectly with Sophia's message about her captor's plan to take her to the Pine Barrens. If Kellerman had indeed transported Sophia, and possibly other victims, to that remote wilderness area, it would explain why no trace of the girls had ever been found, despite extensive searches in other locations. Chen immediately contacted New Jersey State Police to coordinate searches of the Pine Barrens region. The area covered over 1 million acres of wilderness, making a comprehensive search impossible, but investigators hoped that additional evidence from Kellerman's abandoned house might provide clues about specific locations within the vast preserve. The search of Kellerman's property records revealed that he had owned a small hunting cabin in the Pine Barrens, purchased in 1995 and never sold despite his apparent disappearance. The cabin was located in a remote section of the preserve, accessible only by a series of unmarked dirt roads that would be difficult to find without detailed knowledge of the area. As the investigation team prepared to search Kellerman's cabin, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally approaching the end of a trail that had begun 12 years earlier with a little girl's disappearance from Central Park. But they also knew that whatever they found in the Pine Barrens would likely bring more questions than answers, and that the truth about Sophia Torres might be more terrible than anyone had imagined. The drive to the Pine Barrens felt like a journey into the heart of darkness itself, with Carmen Torres insisting on accompanying the investigation team despite their concerns about what they might discover. As their vehicles navigated the increasingly narrow dirt roads that led toward Kellerman's cabin, everyone involved in the search understood that they were about to confront truths that had been hidden in the wilderness for over a decade. But nothing could have prepared them for what they would find when they finally reached the end of that lonely road, or for the revelation that would transform their understanding of not just Sophia's case, but of David Kellerman himself. The road to David Kellerman's cabin wound through increasingly dense Pine Barrens wilderness, each mile taking the investigation team deeper into a landscape that seemed designed to swallow secrets. Detective Costa gripped the steering wheel of the lead vehicle, following GPS coordinates that led them along unmarked dirt roads that hadn't seen regular maintenance in years. Behind him, Carmen Torres sat in tense silence, staring out at the endless expanse of pine trees that stretched in every direction. Lieutenant Chen coordinated the convoy from her position in the second vehicle, staying in constant radio contact with New Jersey State Police units that were approaching the location from different directions. The operation had been planned with military precision. They were treating this as a potential crime scene that might contain evidence of multiple homicides, and everyone involved understood the gravity of what they might discover. The cabin itself appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, a small wooden structure that looked like it had been abandoned for years. Paint peeled from its weathered siding, windows were boarded up with plywood sheets, and the surrounding property was overgrown with vegetation that had reclaimed most of the clearing where the building stood. It was exactly the kind of isolated location where someone could dispose of evidence without fear of discovery. Chen established a perimeter around the property, while Costa documented the scene with photographs and video. The cabin sat on approximately 2 acres of cleared land, surrounded by dense forest that extended for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor was over 3 miles away, and the location was so remote that even GPS navigation had difficulty maintaining a reliable signal. The first thing investigators noticed was that despite its abandoned appearance, the cabin showed signs of recent activity. Tire tracks in the dirt driveway were relatively fresh, and there were footprints around the building that appeared to have been made within the past several months. Someone had been visiting this location regularly, even though official records showed that David Kellerman had disappeared over 11 years ago. The front door of the cabin was secured with a heavy-duty padlock that looked new compared to the deteriorating building around it. Costa cut through the lock with bolt cutters, noting that the metal showed no signs of weathering despite the cabin's apparent abandonment. Inside, the team discovered that the building had been maintained far better than its exterior suggested. The main room of the cabin was spartanly furnished but clean and organized. There was a small kitchen area with basic supplies, a sleeping area with a simple cot, and most unnervingly, a desk covered with notebooks, photographs, and maps. The walls were covered with more pictures of young girls, similar to what they had found in the basement on Fresh Pond Road, but these photographs appeared to be more recent. Among the photographs on the cabin walls, investigators immediately recognized both Sophia Torres and Emma Caldwell, But there were also pictures of other girls, some of whom appeared to have been taken very recently. The implications were chilling. If David Kellerman was still alive and operating from this location, he might have continued abducting children throughout the years that everyone assumed he had disappeared. Costa examined the desk area carefully, noting that the notebooks contained entries dated as recently as the previous month. The handwriting matched samples from the house in Queens, confirming that David Kellerman was indeed still alive and using this cabin as a base of operations. The recent entries focused on potential new victims, with detailed surveillance notes about children in the New York and Philadelphia areas. But it was the discovery in the cabin's back room that would provide the investigation with its most significant breakthrough. Behind a bookshelf that had been modified to serve as a hidden door, investigators found a small room that functioned as Kellerman's private sanctuary. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings about missing children cases, police reports that had somehow been obtained illegally, and most disturbing of all, personal items that had belonged to his victims. Among these trophies, Carmen Torres immediately recognized a small silver bracelet that had belonged to Sophia. It was a piece of jewelry that Sophia had been wearing on the day she disappeared, something that Carmen had mentioned to investigators, but that had never been found during the initial search of Central Park. Seeing her daughter's bracelet in this terrible place confirmed Carmen's worst fears about Sophia's fate. The collection of personal items was extensive and heartbreaking. There were pieces of clothing, toys, jewelry, and other small objects that had belonged to dozens of children over what appeared to be several decades. Each item was carefully labeled with a date and location, creating a grotesque catalogue of Kellerman's crimes that stretched back to the early 1990s. Detective Chen found a ledger that contained detailed records of every child Kellerman had abducted. The entries were clinical and methodical, recording dates, locations, physical descriptions, and what appeared to be codes indicating the ultimate fate of each victim. The ledger contained over 40 entries, representing far more victims than investigators had initially suspected. Sophia Torres' entry in the ledger was dated October 15, 2010, with notes about her physical appearance and personality traits that matched the surveillance records found at the Queen's house. But the entry also contained information that hadn't been included in the other records, notes about Sophia's intelligence and observational skills that suggested Kellerman had recognized her as a potential threat to his operation. The ledger entry for Sophia included a chilling notation. Subject displayed unusual awareness of surveillance, attempted to communicate with outside parties through hidden messages. Disposal delayed pending security assessment. The entry was dated November 20, 2010, more than a month after Sophia's abduction, confirming that she had been held alive for an extended period. Emma Caldwell's entry was similarly detailed, dated December 3, 2008, with notes indicating that she had also been held for several weeks before her ultimate fate was decided. The pattern suggested that Kellerman kept his victims alive for extended periods, possibly weeks or months, before making final decisions about their disposal. But it was the discovery of a hidden basement beneath the cabin that would reveal the full scope of Kellerman's operation. Costa noticed inconsistencies in the cabin's floor plan and discovered a concealed trapdoor beneath a rug in the main room. The basement below was larger than the cabin itself, extending under the surrounding property through a series of excavated tunnels and chambers. The basement complex was sophisticated and well-maintained, with electric lighting, ventilation systems, and multiple rooms that had clearly been designed for long-term occupancy. There were sleeping areas, bathroom facilities, and even a small kitchen setup. It was essentially an underground bunker, where Kellerman could hold multiple victims simultaneously, without fear of detection. The basement also contained evidence that some of Kellerman's victims might still be alive. Fresh food supplies, recently used bedding, and personal hygiene items suggested that the facility had been occupied within the past few days. The discovery raised the terrifying possibility that children were being held at this location, even as the investigation team conducted their search. Chen immediately called for additional backup and specialized rescue teams, treating the situation as an active hostage scenario. If there were children being held in this underground complex, every minute of delay could mean the difference between life and death. The search of the basement became urgent and systematic, with officers checking every room and passage for signs of current occupancy. The search revealed a series of small rooms that had clearly been used as individual cells for holding victims. Each room contained a simple bed, basic sanitation facilities, and walls covered with children's drawings and writing. The artwork was heartbreaking. Pictures of families, homes, and pets drawn by children who were desperately trying to maintain connections to the lives they had been stolen from. Among these drawings, investigators found artwork that was clearly the work of Sofia Torres. Her distinctive style and the subjects she chose to draw matched examples Carmen had provided from Sofia's schoolwork. The drawings showed Sofia's progression during her captivity, starting with pictures of her mother and their apartment, then gradually becoming darker and more disturbed as time passed. One of Sofia's drawings showed a detailed map of the basement layout, with notations in her careful handwriting indicating different rooms and passages. It was clear that Sofia had been studying her prison environment, possibly planning an escape attempt, or documenting information she hoped would someday be useful to investigators. But the most significant discovery in the basement was a room that appeared to function as Kellerman's personal office and planning center. The room contained extensive files on hundreds of potential victims, including children who had never been abducted but had been under surveillance for months or years. The files revealed the true scope of Kellerman's operation. He had been studying and stalking children throughout the northeastern United States for decades. The files also contained detailed information about law enforcement procedures, security systems, and investigative techniques. Kellerman had clearly spent considerable time studying how police investigations were conducted, allowing him to stay one step ahead of authorities for over 20 years. His knowledge of police procedures explained how he had been able to cover his tracks so effectively. Among Kellerman's files, investigators found documents that revealed his connection to the security industry. He had worked for multiple companies over the years, always in positions that gave him access to sensitive information about building security and alarm systems. His legitimate employment had provided him with the knowledge and credentials necessary to move freely through urban environments while conducting surveillance on potential victims. The files also revealed Kellerman's psychological profile through his own written analysis of his crimes. He had documented his selection criteria for victims, his methods for conducting surveillance, and his procedures for abduction and disposal. The writing was clinical and detached, showing no evidence of remorse or recognition that his actions caused harm to his victims and their families. Most disturbing were Kellerman's notes about his interactions with the children he held captive. He had documented their personalities, their attempts to escape or communicate with the outside world, and his decisions about how long to keep them alive. The notes revealed a methodical killer who viewed his victims as objects to be studied and disposed of when they no longer served his purposes. The basement search also uncovered evidence of Kellerman's disposal methods. A series of tunnels led from the basement to natural depressions in the surrounding forest, where he had buried his victims. Ground-penetrating radar revealed anomalies in the soil that suggested multiple burial sites scattered throughout the property. The excavation of these burial sites began immediately, with forensic anthropologists working to recover remains that might provide evidence about the fate of Kellerman's victims. The work was painstaking and emotionally devastating, as each discovery confirmed another family's worst fears about their missing child. Among the remains recovered from the first burial site, investigators found evidence that confirmed the identity of Emma Caldwell. Personal items buried with the remains matched descriptions provided by Emma's family, and dental records would later provide positive identification. The discovery brought closure to Emma's family after nearly 14 years of uncertainty, but it also confirmed the worst fears about David Kellerman's crimes. The excavation continued over several days, revealing a total of 8 burial sites containing the remains of children who had been murdered over a span of nearly 2 decades. Each discovery added to the growing evidence of Kellerman's systematic approach to his crimes and his complete disregard for human life. But throughout the entire search of the cabin and basement complex, investigators found no trace of Sofia Torres' remains. Her personal items were present, her artwork was found throughout the facility, and there was clear evidence that she had been held at this location for an extended period. But unlike the other victims, Sofia's body was not among those buried on the property. The absence of Sofia's remains raised troubling questions about her ultimate fate. Kellerman's ledger contained an entry about her disposal, but the notation was different from those used for other victims. Instead of the codes that appeared to indicate burial or other forms of disposal, Sophia's entry contained a question mark and the notation, "Special handling required." Costa and Chen spent hours reviewing all the evidence related to Sophia's captivity, trying to understand why her case had been handled differently from the others. The surveillance notes indicated that Kellerman had been concerned about Sophia's intelligence and her attempts to leave messages for potential rescuers. Had these concerns led him to dispose of her in a different way? The investigation took on new urgency, as the team realized that they still didn't have answers about Sophia's ultimate fate. While they had confirmed that she had been held by David Kellerman and had survived for at least several weeks after her abduction, they still didn't know whether she was alive or dead, or where her remains might be located if she had been killed. Carmen Torres struggled with the mixed emotions of finally having concrete answers about her daughter's abduction, while still facing uncertainty about Sophia's fate. The evidence proved that Sophia had been alive and aware during her captivity, that she had tried to leave clues for her eventual rescue, and that she had maintained hope even in the darkest circumstances. But the absence of her remains left Carmen suspended between grief and hope in a way that was almost unbearable. The search for David Kellerman himself became the investigation's top priority. If he was still alive and operating from this location, he might have information about Sophia's fate that could finally provide Carmen with the closure she desperately needed. But Kellerman had proven himself to be extremely elusive over the years, and tracking him down would require resources and expertise from multiple law enforcement agencies. Chen coordinated with the FBI to establish a task force focused specifically on locating Kellerman. His recent activity at the cabin proved that he was still alive and active, but it also suggested that he might be preparing to disappear permanently if he suspected that investigators were closing in on his operation. The task force began analyzing the surveillance notes found at the cabin, looking for patterns that might indicate where Kellerman was currently conducting his activities. The notes revealed that he had been watching children in several different cities, suggesting that he might be preparing for additional abductions, or that he might already be holding other victims at unknown locations. As the investigation expanded, Costa made a discovery that would change everything they thought they knew about David Kellerman and his connection to Sophia Torres. Hidden in a false bottom of one of Kellerman's desk drawers was a birth certificate and other documents that revealed a shocking truth about the man they had been hunting. David Kellerman was not his real name. The documents revealed that he had been born David Antonelli in 1967 and that he had legally changed his name in 1995, following a series of events that had transformed him from a potential victim of crime into one of the most prolific child killers in American history. But it was the final document in the hidden drawer that would shake the investigation to its core. It was a custody agreement, dated 1993, showing that David Antonelli had once been the legal guardian of a 7-year-old girl named Emma Antonelli, his younger sister, who had been placed in his care following their parents' death in a car accident. The custody records told a tragic story of a young man who had tried to care for his sister, but had ultimately failed in ways that led to devastating consequences. Emma Antonelli had died in 1995 while under her brother's care, officially from complications related to pneumonia, but the circumstances surrounding her death had raised enough questions that David had been investigated by Child Protective Services. The investigation into Emma's death had been inconclusive, but the trauma of losing his sister and the suspicion that had surrounded her death had apparently triggered something in David that had led him down a path of increasingly violent behavior. The first documented disappearance connected to David Kellerman had occurred just months after his sister's death, suggesting that his crimes were motivated by a twisted attempt to replace the sister he had lost. This revelation explained the pattern investigators had noticed in Kellerman's victim selection. All of his victims bore a physical resemblance to his sister, Emma, and all were approximately the same age she had been when she died. Kellerman wasn't just abducting children randomly. He was trying to recreate his relationship with his sister over and over again, with victims who could never truly fill the void her death had left in his life. Understanding Kellerman's motivation provided the investigation team with new insights into his behavior, but it also raised terrifying questions about Sophia Torres's fate. If Kellerman had been using his victims as substitutes for his dead sister, what had made Sophia different from the others? Why had she received special handling instead of being killed and buried like the rest? The answer to that question would require finding David Kellerman himself, but as the investigation team prepared to expand their search beyond the Pine Barrens cabin, they discovered evidence that suggested their quarry was already aware of their presence and might be preparing for a final confrontation that would determine not just Sophia's fate, but the fate of any other children who might still be under his control. The manhunt for David Kellerman began at dawn the morning after the discoveries at the Pine Barrens cabin, with law enforcement agencies across 3 states coordinating the largest search operation in the region's recent history. Detective Costa found himself at the center of a task force that included FBI agents, state police investigators, and specialized units trained in tracking fugitive suspects. The urgency was palpable. Every hour that passed meant Kellerman could be moving further from their reach, potentially taking with him the answers about Sophia Torres's fate that Carmen had been seeking for 12 agonizing years. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Gas station security footage from a location 15 miles from Kellerman's cabin showed a man matching his description purchasing supplies just 2 days before the law enforcement raid. The timestamp on the footage indicated that Kellerman had been at the cabin recently, confirming the team's suspicion that he was still actively using the location as a base of operations. More disturbing was the nature of Kellerman's purchases. In addition to basic food and fuel, the security footage showed him buying plastic sheeting, heavy-duty garbage bags, and industrial-strength cleaning supplies, materials that could be used for body disposal or crime scene cleanup. The timing of these purchases suggested that Kellerman might have been preparing for something significant, possibly including the disposal of evidence or victims. Lieutenant Chen coordinated with state and federal databases to track Kellerman's movements through financial records and surveillance systems. The investigation revealed that he had been using multiple false identities over the years, maintaining bank accounts and credit cards under at least 4 different names. The sophistication of his identity theft operation explained how he had managed to remain hidden for so long, while continuing his criminal activities. The financial records showed a pattern of movement throughout the northeastern corridor, with transactions indicating regular travel between New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. The pattern aligned with the geographic distribution of missing children cases that investigators had connected to Kellerman's operation, confirming that he had been hunting victims across multiple states for decades. But it was the discovery of Kellerman's most recent credit card activity that provided the investigation team with their most promising lead. 3 days before the raid on his cabin, Kellerman had made purchases at a hardware store in Trenton, New Jersey, followed by transactions at a gas station and fast food restaurant in the same area. The clustering of purchases suggested that he might be operating from a new location in central New Jersey. Costa and a team of federal agents immediately began searching the Trenton area for properties that might serve as Kellerman's backup hideout. They focused on abandoned buildings, remote properties, and any locations that would provide the isolation necessary for holding victims. The search was complicated by the urban nature of the area, which offered numerous potential hiding places, but also increased the risk of civilian exposure if Kellerman was still holding captives. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis of evidence from the Pine Barrens cabin continued to yield disturbing revelations about the scope of Kellerman's crimes. DNA analysis confirmed that children had been held in the basement facility as recently as the previous month, suggesting that Kellerman's operation was still active even as investigators had been closing in on his location. The DNA evidence also revealed something that shocked everyone involved in the investigation. Among the recent biological samples found in the basement was genetic material that matched Sophia Torres. The evidence indicated that Sophia had been at the cabin within the past 6 months, more than 12 years after her initial abduction. The implications of this discovery were staggering. If Sophia had been at the cabin recently, it meant she was still alive, and that Kellerman had been holding her for over a decade. The revelation transformed the investigation from a murder case into an active kidnapping with a living victim who might still be rescued. Carmen Torres's reaction to this news was a mixture of overwhelming relief and desperate urgency. For 12 years, she had lived with the uncertainty of not knowing whether her daughter was alive or dead. Now, faced with concrete evidence that Sophia was still alive, Carmen felt a renewed sense of hope that was almost painful in its intensity. But the DNA evidence also raised troubling questions about Sophia's condition after 12 years of captivity. She would now be 19 years old, having spent her entire adolescence under the control of a dangerous predator. The psychological trauma of such prolonged captivity would be severe, and investigators worried about what they might find when they eventually located her. The search for Kellerman's current location intensified as the team realized they were racing against time to rescue a living victim rather than simply seeking justice for the dead. The FBI deployed specialized tracking units, and the media was enlisted to broadcast Kellerman's photograph and physical description throughout the region. The media coverage generated hundreds of tips from the public, most of which proved to be false leads or cases of mistaken identity. But among the flood of information, investigators identified several credible sightings that helped narrow their search area. Multiple witnesses reported seeing a man matching Kellerman's description in and around Trenton during the past week, confirming that he was likely still in the central New Jersey area. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a postal worker who recognized Kellerman's photograph from the news coverage. The postal worker reported that he had been delivering mail to a house on the outskirts of Trenton that matched the name on one of Kellerman's false identities. The property was isolated, surrounded by wooded land, and the postal worker noted that he had occasionally seen what appeared to be a young woman at the property who seemed to avoid contact with outsiders. The description of the young woman sent chills through the investigation team. If Sofia Torres had indeed been held for 12 years, she would have aged from a 7-year-old child into a 19-year-old adult. The postal worker's sighting might represent the first confirmed visual contact with Sofia since her disappearance from Central Park. Chen coordinated with local SWAT teams to plan a careful approach to the Trenton property. The operation had to balance the need for speed with the requirement to avoid actions that might prompt Kellerman to harm Sofia or other potential victims. The team spent hours studying the property layout, identifying entry points, and developing contingency plans for various scenarios they might encounter. The property surveillance began immediately, with undercover officers positioned around the perimeter to monitor activity at the house. The surveillance revealed clear signs of current occupancy, including lights in the windows during evening hours and smoke from the chimney that indicated active heating. Most importantly, officers observed movement inside the house that suggested the presence of at least 2 individuals. On the second day of surveillance, investigators witnessed something that confirmed their worst fears and highest hopes simultaneously. Through a second-floor window, they observed a young woman who appeared to match the age and physical characteristics that Sofia Torres would have after 12 years of aging. The woman was visible for only a few seconds, but the sighting was enough to convince the team that they had found their target. The tactical assault on the property was planned for dawn, when Kellerman would be most likely to be caught off guard and least able to react violently. The operation involved multiple teams approaching from different directions, with specialized units trained in hostage rescue leading the entry into the house itself. Carmen Torres was not allowed to accompany the assault team, but she waited at a command post several miles away, surrounded by victim advocates and counselors who would help her navigate whatever they discovered at the property. The wait was excruciating, with radio communications providing only fragmentary updates about the operation's progress. The assault team encountered no resistance as they approached the house, leading to concerns that Kellerman might have discovered their surveillance and fled. But the front door was unlocked, and the team entered to find clear evidence of recent occupancy, including warm food still sitting on the kitchen table. The search of the house revealed a layout similar to Kellerman's other properties, with modifications that suggested long-term captivity arrangements. The basement had been converted into a series of rooms, including sleeping quarters, bathroom facilities, and what appeared to be a small workshop area. Most significantly, the basement showed clear signs of current use, with fresh bedding and personal items indicating recent occupancy. In one of the basement rooms, investigators found evidence that confirmed they were in the right location. Personal items that had belonged to Sofia Torres as a child were displayed on shelves alongside more recent belongings that suggested the presence of a young adult woman. The collection spanned 12 years, representing a grotesque timeline of Sofia's captivity and forced development under Kellerman's control. But the house was empty. Kellerman and his captive had apparently fled shortly before the law enforcement raid, leaving behind evidence of hasty departure, but no indication of where they might have gone. The timing suggested that Kellerman had somehow become aware of the investigation's progress and had moved to a new location with Sophia still under his control. The investigation team found one crucial piece of evidence that provided insight into Kellerman's current state of mind. On the kitchen table, apparently left deliberately for investigators to find, was a handwritten note in Kellerman's familiar script. The message was brief but chilling. "You're getting close, but she's mine now. Emma and I have found our forever home." The note's reference to Emma was particularly disturbing, suggesting that Kellerman's psychological delusion had progressed to the point where he believed Sophia Torres was actually his dead sister. The deterioration of his mental state made him more dangerous and unpredictable, but it also suggested that he might be less careful about covering his tracks as he struggled with his failing grip on reality. Chen immediately expanded the search area and increased the urgency of the manhunt. If Kellerman was experiencing a psychological breakdown, he might make desperate decisions that could endanger Sophia's life. The team had to find them quickly, before Kellerman's delusions led him to take actions that would end the rescue opportunity forever. The analysis of evidence from the Trenton house revealed additional disturbing insights into Sophia's years of captivity. Personal journals found in her room, written in Sophia's handwriting but showing the progression from a child's script to an adult's writing, documented her psychological survival during 12 years of imprisonment. The journals revealed that Sophia had maintained her intelligence and awareness throughout her captivity, continuing to learn and develop despite the horrific circumstances. She had taught herself advanced mathematics, learned to read complex literature, and had even begun studying psychology, possibly as a way to understand her captor and survive her situation. Most remarkably, the journals showed that Sophia had never stopped believing that her mother was looking for her. Entry after entry referenced her hope that Carmen would eventually find the clues she had left and come to rescue her. The faith that sustained Sophia through 12 years of captivity was both heartbreaking and inspiring. But the journals also revealed the psychological toll of her prolonged captivity. Sophia wrote about periods of depression, despair, and fear, as well as her struggle to maintain her sense of identity while living under Kellerman's control. The entries showed a remarkable young woman who had survived unimaginable trauma while retaining her capacity for hope and human connection. The final entries in Sophia's journal, written just days before the law enforcement raid, revealed that she was aware of increased activity around Kellerman that suggested something significant was about to happen. She wrote about his growing anxiety and paranoia, and her fear that he was planning something that would end their current situation permanently. Most chillingly, Sophia's final journal entry suggested that she was aware of Kellerman's plan to take her to what he called their forever home. She wrote about trying to leave additional clues about their destination, but the entry ended abruptly, suggesting that Kellerman had discovered her writing and confiscated the journal before she could complete her thoughts. The search for Kellerman and Sophia expanded to include every state in the northeastern corridor, with particular focus on locations that might have significance in Kellerman's psychological landscape. Investigators returned to his childhood home, examined properties connected to his family history, and explored locations where his sister Emma had lived before her death. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts suggested that Kellerman was entering a final phase of his criminal career, possibly planning a murder-suicide scenario that would allow him to maintain control over Sophia while avoiding capture. The analysts warned that approaching Kellerman in this state would be extremely dangerous, as he would likely view any law enforcement contact as a threat that required violent response. 3 days after the failed raid in Trenton, a new lead emerged from an unexpected source. A nurse at a hospital in upstate New York contacted authorities about a patient who had been brought to the emergency room with injuries consistent with abuse. The patient was a young woman who appeared to be in her late teens, and she had managed to whisper a single word to the nurse before losing consciousness: Sophia. The hospital was over 200 miles from Trenton, indicating that Kellerman had moved much further than investigators had expected. The location also suggested that he might be heading toward more remote areas where he could avoid detection while carrying out whatever final plan he had developed. Costa and Chen immediately coordinated with New York State Police to respond to the hospital, hoping that they had finally located Sophia Torres. But they also prepared for the possibility that this might be another of Kellerman's victims, or that the situation might be even more complex than they had imagined. The race to the hospital felt like the culmination of 12 years of searching, investigation, and hope. Carmen Torres insisted on accompanying the team, despite the concerns about what they might find when they arrived. For her, this represented the closest she had come to reuniting with her daughter since that terrible October evening in Central Park, when Sophia had simply vanished from her life. As their convoy sped through the New York countryside toward the hospital, none of them could have anticipated that the young woman they were rushing to see would provide them with information that would completely transform their understanding of David Kellerman, Sophia Torres, and the twisted relationship that had developed between captor and victim over 12 years of forced isolation. The truth they were about to discover would challenge everything they thought they knew about Stockholm Syndrome, survival, and the lengths to which human beings will go to preserve their own lives and sanity in the face of unimaginable horror. The young woman lying in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the 7-year-old girl who had disappeared from Central Park 12 years earlier, but Carmen Torres recognized her daughter immediately. The recognition wasn't based on physical features, which had changed dramatically during Sophia's years of captivity, but on something deeper and more fundamental: the way Sophia held her hands, the particular curve of her mouth, and most of all, the intelligent awareness in her eyes that had always set her apart from other children. Detective Costa stood beside Carmen as they looked through the observation window at Sophia Torres, now 19 years old and recovering from injuries that doctors described as consistent with a serious fall or car accident. Sophia was conscious but sedated, her body bearing the physical evidence of 12 years lived in circumstances that no child should ever endure. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the attending physician, briefed the investigation team on Sophia's condition. She had been brought to the emergency room by David Kellerman himself, who had claimed to be her father, and had provided identification under one of his false identities. Kellerman had told hospital staff that Sophia had been injured in a hiking accident, but the nature of her injuries and her apparent malnourishment suggested a much more complex situation. What had prompted medical staff to contact authorities was Sophia's behavior once she regained consciousness. Despite being heavily sedated, she had become agitated when nurses tried to contact the man who had brought her in, repeatedly whispering warnings that he was dangerous and that his name was not what he had told them. Her insistence that her real name was Sophia Torres, combined with her obvious fear of her supposed father, had led hospital security to investigate further. The investigation revealed that Kellerman had left the hospital shortly after bringing Sophia to the emergency room, claiming that he needed to retrieve insurance paperwork from his car. Hospital security footage showed him driving away in a stolen vehicle that was later found abandoned at a truck stop 20 miles away. By the time authorities arrived at the hospital, Kellerman had vanished once again, but this time he had left behind the most important evidence of his crimes: his surviving victim. Sophia's first coherent conversation was with Carmen Torres, though the reunion was far more complex and emotionally difficult than either of them had imagined. 12 years of separation had created a gulf between mother and daughter that couldn't be bridged simply by their physical proximity. Sophia had aged from a child into an adult, while Carmen had frozen her memory of her daughter at age 7, and both struggled to reconcile their expectations with the reality of their reunion. Carmen had to confront the devastating truth that Sophia barely remembered their life together before the abduction. 12 years of captivity had begun when Sophia was still forming her core memories, and Kellerman's systematic manipulation had deliberately obscured many of her recollections of life with her family. Sophia knew intellectually that Carmen was her mother, but the emotional connection had been damaged by years of psychological manipulation and trauma. For Sophia, the hospital reunion represented freedom from captivity, but also terrifying uncertainty about a world she barely remembered. She had spent her formative years in isolation, with only Kellerman for human contact, and his twisted version of reality had become her normal. The prospect of integrating into a society she had never really known was overwhelming and frightening. Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist specializing in trauma recovery, was brought in to help facilitate communication between Sophia and the investigation team. Dr. E. Chen explained that Sophia's psychological state was complex and fragile, shaped by 12 years of what amounted to systematic brainwashing combined with her own remarkable resilience and intelligence. Sophia's account of her captivity, told in fragments over several days of careful interviews, revealed a story of survival that was both horrifying and inspiring. Kellerman had indeed been motivated by his desire to replace his dead sister Emma, but his psychological manipulation of Sophia had evolved over the years into something even more disturbing than investigators had initially understood. During the early years of her captivity, Sophia had been treated as a replacement for Kellerman's sister, forced to answer to the name Emma and to participate in elaborate role-playing scenarios that recreated Kellerman's memories of his childhood with his sister. But as Sophia grew older and her own personality became more assertive, Kellerman's delusions had shifted in ways that made their relationship increasingly dangerous. By the time Sophia reached her teenage years, Kellerman had begun to see her not just as a replacement for his sister, but as the sister herself, somehow returned to him and aging as she would have if she had never died. This progression in his delusion had led to increasingly erratic and violent behavior, as reality failed to match his psychological needs. Sophia described years of careful psychological manipulation designed to make her dependent on Kellerman and convinced that the outside world was dangerous and unwelcoming. He had told her that her family had stopped looking for her, that she had been declared dead, and that she had no identity or place in the world beyond their isolated existence together. But Sophia's intelligence and inner strength had never been completely suppressed. She had maintained secret journals, hidden messages, and mental records of her experiences, always believing that someday the truth would emerge and she would find a way to escape or be rescued. Her decision to leave clues at Central Park had been part of a larger strategy of resistance that she had maintained throughout her captivity. The investigation team learned that Sophia's recent injury had occurred during an escape attempt. As Kellerman's mental state had deteriorated in recent months, Sophia had recognized that her situation was becoming increasingly dangerous. She had tried to flee from their temporary hideout, but Kellerman had pursued her, and she had been injured during the chase. Kellerman's decision to bring Sophia to the hospital represented a moment of psychological crisis where his concern for her physical well-being had temporarily overcome his need to maintain control over her. It was a miscalculation that had finally given investigators the opportunity to rescue Sophia and potentially capture Kellerman himself. But the manhunt for Kellerman continued even as Sophia began the long process of physical and psychological recovery. His abandoned vehicle had been found near a series of abandoned buildings that might provide hiding places, but searches of the area had produced no sign of his current location. The investigation team worried that losing Sophia might have pushed Kellerman toward a final act of violence that could endanger innocent civilians. The breakthrough in locating Kellerman came from Sophia herself. As she became more comfortable speaking with investigators, she provided detailed information about the locations where she had been held over the years. Her descriptions led the team to several additional properties that Kellerman had used, and more importantly, to an understanding of his psychological patterns that helped predict where he might go when cornered. Sophia explained that Kellerman had often spoken about a special place where he planned to take her when their time together was ending. He had described it as a location where they could be together forever, away from the interference of the outside world. Sophia's description of this place, combined with research into Kellerman's family history, led investigators to a remote cabin in the Adirondack Mountains that had belonged to his grandparents. The cabin was located in an extremely isolated area, accessible only by hiking trails and surrounded by thousands of acres of wilderness. It was exactly the kind of location where someone could disappear permanently, either by choice or through violence. The investigation team realized that Kellerman might be planning a murder-suicide scenario that would allow him to maintain control over the narrative of his crimes, even in death. The approach to the Adirondack cabin required careful planning and specialized equipment. The location was so remote that helicopters couldn't land nearby, and the hiking approach would take several hours through difficult terrain. The team had to balance speed with stealth, hoping to reach Kellerman before he could implement whatever final plan he had developed. Carmen Torres was not allowed to accompany the tactical team, but she insisted on being as close to the operation as possible. She had waited 12 years to learn the truth about her daughter's fate, and now that Sophia was safe, she wanted to see justice served for the man who had stolen so many years from their family. The hike to Kellerman's grandfather's cabin took the tactical team through some of the most challenging terrain in the Adirondack Park. The route followed unmarked trails through dense forest, across streams, and over rocky terrain that would be nearly impossible to navigate in darkness. The team moved carefully, knowing that Kellerman might have set traps or might be watching for their approach. The cabin appeared suddenly through a break in the trees, a small structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. Smoke rising from the chimney indicated current occupancy, but the building showed no other signs of activity. The tactical team established a perimeter and began the careful process of determining whether Kellerman was actually inside the cabin and whether he might have other victims with him. The siege of the cabin lasted nearly 6 hours, with negotiators trying to establish communication with Kellerman while tactical specialists prepared for various scenarios. Kellerman eventually responded to their calls, but his statements revealed a man who had completely lost touch with reality. Kellerman claimed that he was protecting Emma from people who wanted to hurt her, and he refused to acknowledge that Sofia Torres was a separate person who had been kidnapped and held against her will. His delusions had progressed to the point where he genuinely believed that Sofia was his sister Emma, somehow returned to him after years of separation. The negotiation process revealed the depth of Kellerman's psychological deterioration. He alternated between lucid moments, where he seemed to understand his situation, and periods of complete delusion, where he spoke to people who weren't there and referenced events that had never occurred. The unpredictability of his mental state made the situation extremely dangerous for everyone involved. As evening approached and temperatures began to drop, the tactical team realized that they couldn't wait indefinitely for Kellerman to surrender. The remote location meant that medical assistance would be difficult to provide if anyone was injured, and Kellerman's deteriorating mental state suggested that he might become violent without warning. The final assault on the cabin was swift and decisive. Tactical officers entered through multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming Kellerman before he could react with violence. They found him sitting at a small table, looking at photographs of his sister Emma that he had apparently been carrying with him for decades. Kellerman's surrender was anticlimactic compared to the years of investigation that had led to this moment. He offered no resistance and seemed confused about why armed officers were in the cabin. He kept asking about Emma's whereabouts and insisting that he needed to protect her from dangerous people who wanted to take her away from him. The arrest of David Kellerman brought an end to one of the longest-running and most complex criminal investigations in New York State history. But for Carmen Torres and Sofia, the end of the manhunt marked the beginning of an even more challenging journey toward healing and rebuilding their relationship. Sofia's recovery would take years and would require extensive psychological support and therapy. The trauma of 12 years of captivity had left deep scars that couldn't be healed quickly or easily. But Sofia's intelligence and inner strength, the same qualities that had helped her survive her ordeal, would also help her rebuild her life and eventually find peace. Carmen Torres had to learn to be a mother to a daughter who was now an adult, someone who had been shaped by experiences that Carmen could barely comprehend. The little girl who had disappeared from Central Park was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who was both stronger and more fragile than anyone could have imagined. The legal proceedings against Kellerman would continue for months, with prosecutors building cases not just for Sofia's kidnapping, but for the murders of at least 8 other children, whose remains had been found at his various properties. Sofia's testimony would be crucial to these prosecutions, forcing her to relive her trauma in service of justice for Kellerman's other victims. Detective Costa and Lieutenant Chen were honored for their work on the case, but both struggled with the knowledge that their success had come too late for most of Kellerman's victims. Sofia Torres was the sole survivor of a criminal operation that had claimed the lives of children over more than 2 decades, and her rescue represented both triumph and tragedy. The case also led to significant changes in how missing children investigations were conducted, with new protocols for interagency cooperation and new technologies for tracking suspects across state lines. Sofia's story became a catalyst for reforms that would hopefully prevent future tragedies of similar scope and duration. For Sofia herself, the years ahead would be challenging, but not without hope. She had survived the worst that human evil could inflict while retaining her essential humanity and capacity for love. Her relationship with her mother would require patience and understanding from both of them, but it would eventually grow into something deeper and more meaningful than what they had lost. The carousel in Central Park continued to turn, carrying new generations of children on painted horses that had witnessed both tragedy and eventual redemption. Sofia Torres had left that carousel as a 7-year-old child and returned to it in spirit, if not in person, as a 19-year-old survivor who had proven that even in the darkest circumstances, hope could endure, and love could eventually find a way to heal what seemed irreparably broken. Carmen Torres would visit that carousel every year on the anniversary of Sofia's disappearance, but now her tears would be mixed with gratitude rather than pure grief. Her daughter was alive, damaged but healing, and they had been given a second chance at the relationship that David Kellerman had tried to destroy. The case of Sofia Torres would be studied for years by law enforcement professionals, psychologists, and legal experts, trying to understand how such crimes could be prevented and how survivors could be helped to heal. But for Carmen and Sofia Torres, the most important truth was simpler and more fundamental. They had found each other again, and no matter how long the journey ahead might be, they would walk it together. The mystery that had begun with a little girl's disappearance from a carousel had ended with the reunion of a mother and daughter who had never stopped believing in the possibility of finding each other again. In a world where such stories rarely have happy endings, Sofia Torres had become living proof that love could endure even the most terrible circumstances, and that the human spirit could survive almost anything if it held on to hope. The investigation was officially closed, the criminal was in custody, and the victim was safe. But for Sofia Torres and her family, the real work of healing and rebuilding their lives was just beginning. It would be a long journey, but they would travel it together, strengthened by the knowledge that they had already survived the worst and emerged with their capacity for love intact.